1920s is known for its very distinctive culture. We start to see many new movements come out of the 1920s. One of the reasons for that is that we are going to see more and more Americans who are actually going to school. Remember, in the Progressive Era, we see children who are required to go to school. Those are compulsory school attendance laws. So now we see that it is just expanded and that more and more people are going to not only to high school, but on to college as well in some cases. We see that a lot more coverage of events is being covered in the news, in the media, on the radio, which is going to keep many Americans informed about various events that are going on around our nation. We see a boom in our cultural arts, things like music, literature, the theater. All of these are going to boom in the 1920s, mostly because when people are prospering and they have more money, they can spend more money on various things that they want to in their leisure time. There were many writers in the 1920s who felt alienated, meaning they felt isolated in this culture. They felt like too much of our culture in America in the 1920s was focused on material wealth and material goods. So a lot of them are actually going to become what we call expatriates. They're going to move to France to practice their craft, to write, and to do various things. And there's a whole kind of community of Americans who were living there at the time to just write about what they were feeling at the time. F. Scott Fitzgerald writes the famous book, The Great Gatsby, that really highlights some of the culture of the 1920s. In fact, he's the one that's going to coin that phrase, the Jazz Age. That's one of the reasons it gets that nickname in the 1920s. Some of those other artists and authors are going to be Gertrude Stein, who writes The Lost Generation, Ernest Hemingway, who writes Farewell to Arms, talking about the end of World War I, For Whom the Bell Tolls. These are going to be some of the major writers in the 20s that are going to focus on the culture in the 20s and the seemingly materialistic nature of the 1920s. Again, because of all that leisure time, people are going to also start following various sporting events, and they have really famous athletes like Babe Ruth, who you see pictured here on the right. You've got football players, and various colleges are going to also start having their very own college teams as well, like Notre Dame, for example. Bobby Jones was a golfer, and so again, we just see various sports throughout that they have really loyal and devoted followers. But it wasn't just athletes that people followed. Charles Lindbergh becomes very famous when he becomes the first pilot to have a solo transatlantic flight. And the name of his plane was the Spirit of St. Louis. And again, he becomes that American hero. Everybody loves Charles Lindbergh. And the next one to talk about is Amelia Earhart. Now, she was the first female pilot to have a transatlantic flight. But she actually becomes even more famous, possibly, because of her attempt. She was trying to circumnavigate the globe, meaning she was trying to fly around the world, when her plane goes down in the Pacific. Her plane is never found. It is still a mystery, and many people still investigate it. So this is still one of those things that people are very interested in. Hollywood is going to pop up in the 1920s, where many people are going to be filming a lot of movies in the 20s. Hollywood was a perfect place to do this because of the weather. It's just such a great area because of the weather. Charlie Chaplin was a famous silent actor. His nickname becomes Little Tramp. Clara Bow was one who was, she was beautiful, and many people really liked her as well. And finally, towards the end of the 20s, we have talking films that are introduced. The very first talking film, meaning it's a film with sound, was The Jazz Singer, and that was in 1927. And if you know anything about Mickey Mouse, this is going to be at the end of the 20s and introduced in 1930. There's Clara Bow. And Mickey Mouse. Steamboat Willie was the very first Mickey Mouse cartoon. Now, in the 1920s, you are going to see the birth of something called Black nationalism, which is a focus on African American culture. And Marcus Garvey, in particular, is really going to be key when he is going to be asking African Americans to focus on their own culture there in the 20s. He actually is going to support what's called the Back to Africa movement, where he encouraged African Americans to return to Africa where they would then kind of start their own country, and then they would be the ones in power in Africa, because the idea was that they weren't being treated well here, and they weren't being given their rights here in America, so they should go back to Africa, is why it's called that movement. Now, there were some supporters and followers in the 20s, but it never really pans out, and they're never able going to really be able to have a huge number who follow through with this. Marcus Garvey winds up being arrested and spending some time in jail, and then eventually leaves the United States for a period of time. So his movement just kind of fizzles out. But one that we really want to focus on too is called the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is this focus on African American culture. It was a literary and artistic movement, so it's going to be literature, art, and music that again is going to focus on the everyday lives of African Americans. Langston Hughes, you definitely need to know him, was a really famous poet, so make sure you make note of him. But jazz is also going to be key too. We're going to see several African Americans who are going to gain national fame for their music. Paul Robeson, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, these are all famous jazz artists who come out of the 1920s and out of that Harlem Renaissance movement.